Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
The national park system is an incredible reservoir of wildlife. From charismatic animals like grizzly bears, bison, and wolves, to animals such as moose and pronghorn and sea turtles that, while not usually labeled as charismatic, are indeed charismatic. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Wolves certainly fall under the charismatic megafauna classification. They're majestic and mystifying, and perhaps even lend some romanticism to your backcountry adventures if you are lucky enough to hear a pack howling in chorus after sundown. While it's well known that Yellowstone National Park and Royale National Park have wolf populations, you might not know that Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota also has a resident population of the predators. To learn more about the wolves at Voyageurs National Park and their behavior, we're joined today by Dr. Thomas Gable, the project lead for the Voyageurs Wolf Project. We'll be back in a minute with Dr. Gable.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That is why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to Traveler, Tom.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, wolves are a very charismatic megafauna, and I've long been intrigued by them. I've followed a lot of wolf research going back to, decades ago. Well familiar with Dr. Meach and the research he's done at Royale and what's going on in Yellowstone. And I think, when people start thinking about national parks and wolves, Voyageurs doesn't come up to the top of their list, I don't think.
I don't think so, which is actually surprising because it's actually the only national park in the lower 48 states that never lost its wolf population, as wolves were sort of eradicated throughout much of the United States. Northern Minnesota, there's just a little sliver of habitat in the dense sort of boreal forests there, which is where Voyageurs is. And so we've never lost our wolf population, which makes it fairly unique for a lot of national parks in the lower 48 states, because presumably wolves would have occupied most of those national parks, a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. Why do you think Voyageurs never lost the wolf population? Because of how remote it is, or the landscape, or there just wasn't a lot of cattle ranching going on around it?
Probably a combination of two things. Probably the landscape characteristics made it difficult for people. There's a lot of water, wetlands, difficult environments for people to penetrate well. And so that means there's a lot of pockets where wolves can maybe avoid people to an extent. And then probably most importantly is that Voyageurs borders Ontario, Canada. And so as you cross that border, you basically just have sort of vast forested areas, basically all the way up almost to Hudson Bay, where you get to the tree line. And so you have this large contiguous wolf population that could be coming across the border, because also there's very few people, relatively speaking, north of Voyageurs. There's not a lot of large human communities, so there's a lot of areas for wolves to be. And so as wolves were, let's say, being targeted in Minnesota and places in and around Voyageurs, there's this sort of population of wolves kind of ready to kind of disperse back down into Minnesota, where then they could fill gaps where wolves had been removed as well. So that's probably why. Whereas we think about other areas like Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there are some other national lake shores and things like that. For wolves to get to those areas, they would have to then get through Ontario, Minnesota, and then around to Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula, as wolves are sort of being pushed further north in the US. And that's a lot more difficult to do without having sort of a source population to have wolves kind of continually flow those areas.
I guess the next question is, why study the wolves there? I mean, they study them at Royale just because they've been doing it for decades. The prey predator relationship there between the wolves and the moose, and the impact on the landscape. At Yellowstone, of course, they pretty much extirpated the wolf population there. I think in the 40s there might have been a stray wolf or two in the 50s, until they brought the recovery program in the 90s. And so obviously scientists want to see how the wolves are behaving, getting back into Yellowstone. Why study wolves at Voyageurs?
That's a great question. So there's probably a couple things that are different. Like you mentioned, Isle Royale is a very unique instance where you have wolves out on an island system, which provides a lot of interesting scientific opportunities. And obviously in Yellowstone, they were reintroduced, so it's a great place to study how that changes. So Voyageurs doesn't have, let's say, those unique circumstances that these other national parks do. But what Voyageurs does have are a typical sort of southern boreal forest environment that is typical of a lot of the southern boreal ecosystem all across sort of North America. So Voyageurs' ecosystem is very similar to those you'll find in Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec, so large portions. And one thing that's really unique about Voyageurs is the prey base, in particular, the abundance of beavers that the Voyageurs area has. And not just the park itself, but the area surrounding the park as well. There's a very dense beaver population, which probably mimics a lot of what the beaver population was historically prior to the fur trapping or the fur trade era, when a lot of beavers were were definitely removed from a lot of areas. And so what we're really interested in part, is understanding wolf behavior during the summer, which happens to be when wolves are preying a lot on beavers. And so that was really the impetus to a lot of the work that we're currently doing now, because we want to understand wolf-beaver interactions, because we know beavers are really important food for wolves in places like Voyageurs and other ecosystems. But that studying wolf-beaver interactions has been very difficult, in part because it occurs during summer, which is a time that wolves are very difficult to study, particularly in a place like Voyageurs where you can't observe them. In Yellowstone, for instance, they can watch hunting sequences and things like that. But in a place like Voyageurs, in the summertime, you generally can't see more than 30, 40 feet, sometimes 50 feet. And that makes it very difficult to understand what's going on. So there's many reasons I think I could give you, and I could go on and on about them. But I think part of it is that Voyageurs is sort of a great microcosm of the larger ecosystem, not just in the national park or around it, but of a lot of areas in and around sort of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ontario, and things like that. And so by understanding the wolves in and around Voyageurs, we really start to understand what wolves are doing in this much larger area. And that has a lot of value for people who are interested in wolf ecology, conservation management of wolves, and all sorts of similar topics.
Yeah. Is that unusual that they're so focused on beaver? I mean, you look at the Yellowstone wolf population, and they take down elk. Occasionally they'll take down some bison. You go over to Isle Royale, and moose seems to be their main prey. Don't often hear about beavers being high up on the prey chain.
So it's not unusual. It's just not something that's received a whole lot of focus or attention, because usually folks are very interested, or researchers are very interested in understanding, how wolf populations are connected to their ungulate prey, which are hoofed animals like moose, deer, etc. Because often those are the animals that get the most interest or attention, because those hoofed animals have a lot of socioeconomic value as well. And so those are oftentimes the dynamics that are looked at. But in places like Isle Royale, they have wolf diet data from wolf scats that they've looked at. And in the summer, beavers can be a pretty substantial food source for wolves, ranging from 20, 30, and I think some of their estimates were up to 40 or 50% kind of historically. Now, that doesn't mean it's consistently that way. It kind of fluctuated, but they were able to note that beavers were a pretty sizable part of the diet for wolves during the ice-free season. That's also been documented in a variety of places, such as in Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec, Alaska in some parts. And then you also see it in Europe. So places like Poland and Belarus, where beavers are coming back, because in Europe, like in North America, beavers were extirpated from a lot of their range. They're recovering, and wolves are hunting beavers in those areas. So it's actually a very widespread phenomenon that occurs, and it happens a lot of places. It's just not something that's been studied, and certainly not something you hear a lot of attention being brought to, because most people, either aren't even aware that wolves eat beavers, and if they do, it generally doesn't garner the same kind of attention that you would maybe hear of, like, wolves killing elk or moose or something like that.
What did they switch to during the winter months?
So in our area, they switched to almost exclusively deer. So that's really it. We don't have, there's a low density moose population in Voyageurs and the areas around it. And wolves will very, very rarely kill moose. But in the summer or in the winter, almost everything they're eating is adult deer. Or not adult deer, but deer that are adult size, like, grown-up fawns and adults.
Now, a few years ago, I think it was 2018, you announced that you saw wolves fishing in Voyageurs and around there. So they like their fish diet.
They like their fish diet. One of the big things that we've been able to document through doing our work is really how adaptable wolves are, and how good they are at finding unique food sources during the summer time. And by summer, I don't mean the human summer, which is what we think of as like June, July, and August. I mean the biological summer for wolves, which really happens when their pups are born in April until those pups are effectively reared and capable of traveling around with the pack, which happens at about the middle to end of October. And so during that 7-month period of time, wolves are taking advantage of all sorts of interesting food sources. So fish is one of them that we've documented pretty extensively. Blueberries are another food source that wolves use extensively in our area. Outside of Voyageurs National Park, there's a lot of bear hunting activities that occur, and wolves spend a lot of time in August and early September eating bear bait piles that are intended to that are put out by hunters to hunt and kill bears. So there's all sorts of these really unique food sources that are out there, and wolves are very good at finding them. And so fish is just one of them that wasn't well known prior to our study. Biologists had documented in some areas of North America, particularly in the coastal portions of Alaska, British Columbia, places like that, that wolves would catch and kill salmon in the large salmon runs. But, people didn't know that wolves would go in these little creeks in Minnesota or these little rivers and wait for a long time for suckers to come up these creeks and spawn in the springtime. And so fortunately, we were able to document that initially back in 2018, and we were able to get some really neat video footage of it, which is the first time that had been documented. And then since then, we've just accrued a lot more data on wolves in the area and figured out that actually this behavior, this fishing behavior, we thought it was very rare when we first documented it because it hadn't really been described before in the way that we were seeing it. But actually, it turns out that this is a very common behavior for wolves in our area. We've had numerous packs and numerous individuals from different, presumably unrelated packs that have all done this. And so that seems to indicate that this is actually a behavior that's likely occurring in many areas across northern Minnesota and a lot of the boreal ecosystem. And folks just aren't aware of it because it's a difficult thing to detect and to be able to observe.
Yeah. Have you touched bases with your contacts in Yellowstone or Royale to see if their wolves also are fishers, so to speak?
So we haven't chatted with them explicitly about that. I've heard, I know in Yellowstone, for instance, I think they've seen coyotes catching fish sometimes. I'm not sure if they have anything. There's nothing published that I'm aware of indicating that wolves will catch fish in places like Yellowstone. It's certainly possible that they do. Isle Royale, I know someone who had done some work there, and they said that they thought they had seen some evidence of it, but they couldn't say for sure. Because one of the challenges you have in documenting it is you're generally not going to be able to observe it firsthand. So somehow you have to figure out that they're doing it, or at least in a forested ecosystem like Isle Royale. So you could look at, let's say, wolf scats and say, oh, look, there's a bunch of fish remains in this scat. Well, the problem is you don't know if those remains in that scatter from them actually hunting and killing the fish or just finding a fish carcass somewhere. And so to be able to like demonstrate that they're actually killing, like actively targeting fish, you really need GPS collar data, remote cameras, things like that can demonstrate sort of without a doubt that this is occurring. So when we first tried to publish the data that we collected in Voyageurs, that was actually one of the biggest critiques we got. We didn't have firsthand observations of it at that point. We just had GPS collar data, and we could see where the wolves are spending time, and we found blood from where they'd been eating the fish and stuff. And people, some of the reviewers were asking us, well, how do you know they're not just scavenging fish that died along this creek? And we felt pretty confident they weren't. But then obviously getting video footage sort of removes that doubt completely. And so it's very possible in a place like Isle Royale that it's occurring. It's just very difficult to document.
Now, the situation at Isle Royale, the wolf, moose, prey, predator relationship has been touted as the longest active research project involving prey and predators in North America, maybe the world, and it's more than 5 decades old. When did the Voyageurs Wolf Project begin?
So the Voyageurs Wolf Project really started its work that it's still doing today in 2015. The park had started in 2012 studying wolves. That's when wolves were removed from the endangered species list initially. And so the park had started collaring wolves at that time to try to understand where the packs were, how many wolves were in each pack, what were the wolves dying from, some of the sort of basic statistics you want to monitor a population. And then they'd been doing that for a couple of years. And then in 2015 is when I started my graduate work, which was focused on understanding wolf-beaver interactions. And that was through a collaboration with the National Park Service. And at that time, we were really kind of trying to figure out, well, how do we get maybe some more information on the summer ecology of wolves? So we're able to use a lot of the data and collar wolves that were already on air at that time, and then obviously collar more individuals and start sort of developing the methods that we could really study wolves during the summer. So that first year of 2015 is when we started doing a lot of our predation work, understanding the pup rearing ecology of wolves, and those methods that we started then are the ones we're still currently using today, 10 years later.
Right. Now, the project currently is part of the University of Minnesota, right? Not the Park Service?
Correct. Yep. So we the project was initially, it's sort of as I did different graduate work, and we've had to sort of extend that. So I did my master's at Northern Michigan University. So when we first started, it was a collaboration between Northern Michigan and Voyageurs National Park. And then I finished my master's and I went to the University of Minnesota, which is where I did my PhD. And at that time, we were collaborating with the Park Service as well. And then the projects kind of stayed through the University of Minnesota since I think that was 2017 and 18 when we started doing, or when I started my PhD work.
And your funding comes from?
Well, I'll keep it short, but most of our funding comes through the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which is a really fantastic funding source for natural resource projects in the state. We've gotten 3 large grants from them, which has funded a lot of our work. And then we have over 8,000 private donors who support our work. We share a lot of our work on social media, trying to kind of engage and entertain and also educate folks on wolf ecology. And a lot of those folks then end up donating and supporting the project and keeping it going. And obviously we get a lot of funding through nonprofit grants and various things like that. I won't get into all the weeds of that, but those are probably the 2 biggest funding sources that we have.
Yeah, it can always be a challenge to run a nonprofit organization. Does the Park Service provide any funding or just in-kind help?
A lot of in-kind help right now. So we get like logistical support if we need to use canoes in the backcountry. We keep our boats at their docks and things like that. I don't think from what our conversations with them, they hadn't. Our goal was to make it a long-term project, and that wasn't initially what they had planned when they started. But we have a nice collaboration with them where we can keep all of our equipment that allows us to get the work done that we need, and then obviously are sharing what we learn with them as well.
Yeah, is it a long-term project? I mean, is there a timeline on how long you'll continue your research?
Well, the goal for us is to keep it a long-term project. We don't have a timeline right now. It's kind of like our goal is really to make it a project that is probably analogous to Isle Royale, Yellowstone, and things like that. And the reason is that like you see in those projects, they have found a lot of things out about wolf ecology and the ecosystems that they're studying those wolves in that they probably never would have dreamed of when they first started that work. Because every year you accrue data, you're building this larger and larger data set that allows you to understand these bigger sort of patterns that you wouldn't see if you did a study for 3 or 4 years. And we see that with our project even now. There's still things that we had been thinking after 7 or 8 years of research, and now at 10 years, we go, wow, that's actually a lot different than we anticipated that being because we've been able to get more data. So our goal is to keep it going long term, to try to learn as much as we possibly can about the wolves in this area and the relationship with their prey species. And then also, we want to keep it going in part too, because we think that we have a valuable role as it pertains to sort of outreach and education with the public, where we're able to share a lot of our work directly with folks and engage people and answer questions about the research we're doing, which is fairly uncommon for a lot of wolf research projects, partly because most of them are through agencies, and so it's not as simple to just communicate directly with the public. But we think there's a lot of value of folks being able to learn about our work and then us be able to engage with those people through comments on social media and things like that. So we think there's a lot of sort of scientific value and also social value of keeping the project going long term. And right now, we don't really see any reason that the project's going to end anytime soon.
Good to know that. So, Tom, you mentioned that the project started back in 2015, so roughly a decade ago. How many individuals are there in the park, and how many packs?
So it's a tough one to answer. This is a question we get all the time, and I always give people a pretty dissatisfying answer. And that's because Voyageurs has a very unique shape when you look at it. It's sort of this like oblong shape with a bunch of its water, and then there's a lot of it that's sort of there's not a lot of big chunks of land that are like fully within the park. Like you think of a big park, let's say like the Smoky Mountains or Yellowstone, you have this giant chunk of land and there's lots of animals that can live in there. Well, in Voyageurs, you have a big peninsula in the middle of it, and then you have big lakes, and then you have sort of strips of land on the edges of the park. And the reason I say this is that when you're studying wolves, they have to be where there's obviously big chunks of land. And so we have a lot of wolves that have some of their territories inside of the park, but not all of their territories. So there's a lot of packs that overlap the park, but are not fully within it. I think there's only 2 wolf packs that we've studied so far that have remained within Voyageurs National Park for the entirety of the year. So that means, and that's out of about, on a typical year, we probably have, I'm just thinking through here, how many packs do we have? There's probably about 9 packs that use some of Voyageurs National Park, or that whose territories overlap some of Voyageurs National Park in any given year. That's probably typical. It does fluctuate from year to year, but that's pretty standard. In our area, the average pack has about 4.5 wolves on average. So you can do some sort of math and, okay, we have 9 packs, 4.5, that's somewhere around 40-ish, 45 wolves, something like that. The reason it's difficult to though nail down in a place like Voyageurs, like how many are actually in the park, is because the wolves don't stay within that boundary. It means nothing to them. And so there's really no saying at one time, oh, there's 40 in Voyageurs. It's 40 that might use Voyageurs, but that can vary at any given time. So we generally measure wolf populations in terms of density, because that gives us an estimate of sort of the size of the population, and it doesn't matter where we draw the borders, so to speak. It's just what is the density of animals. And in Voyageurs, in the surrounding area, the density has been about 60 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers for the past 10 years or so. And to put that in perspective, because I know for most people that means absolutely nothing, that is a high density wolf population. If you plotted wolf densities across the world, that would be on the very high end of sustained wolf population densities. And to our knowledge, is one of, if not the highest sustained density of gray wolves that we're aware of in the scientific literature. And so there's a lot of wolves in the area. We just don't have a good estimate for, let's say, Voyageurs specifically.
Yeah. I visited your website, voyagerswolfproject.org, and there's a lot of great information there for people who are curious about wolves in general, as well as wolves at Voyageurs National Park. And, you mentioned the high density there, and one of the maps on your website shows active beaver lodges. and there's just stars everywhere showing all these lodges. Is that one of the reasons why you have such a high wolf density, because there is such a high sustainable prey base?
That's a great question, and I would surmise that it probably is related to it. And it's one of those questions long term we want to get at, but we don't know for sure right now. One thing that we can say, I would suspect that's the case. We just don't have, let's say, quantitative data to show definitively that yes, this is that's the reason we have high densities. But one thing you'll notice in Voyageurs and the surrounding area is that wolf packs have relatively small territories relative to even other places in Minnesota. So, like for the past 10 years, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources summarizes they estimate territories for all the wolves in the state, for instance. And on average, the typical pack territory across Minnesota is about 150 square kilometers. But in Voyageurs, ours is about 100 square kilometers. So we're almost a third smaller. And there's been quite a bit of work that shows that wolf territory size is usually a function of prey density, because wolves aren't going to defend a territory that's any larger than they need to survive, because there's costs. They have to keep out neighbors and fend off intruding wolves and things like that. So it's the smaller the territory, probably the easier it is for wolves to defend that. And so I suspect that's part of it, is that these beavers are a huge food source in the summertime. So wolves have, in theory, more food, so they can have smaller territories, and then you can fit more wolves in an area. So that's our best working theory. But yeah, we can always change it if we get more information, but that's what I would suspect is that. And I think the other thing that's important is the body size of the wolves in our area. So the average wolf in our area is about 28 kilograms, which is about 62 pounds or something like that, which actually is much smaller than when people think about wolves. They think 80, 90, 100, 120 pounds. And some places like Yellowstone, that is the average. The average wolf is pushing 80, 90, 100 pounds, and they get even bigger ones there. Well, the reason that's important is that a bigger wolf is going to need a lot more food to keep going on average than wolves in our area. So you can think about it, they're going to need probably a third more food per wolf than a wolf in our area. And so what that means is that wolves in our area can probably occur at higher densities because each wolf needs less food. So that means there can be more wolves around, even if the amount of prey remains, let's say, similar between Yellowstone and a place like Voyageurs. So I suspect we have a combination of factors of the beavers and then also the size of the wolves in our area.
But didn't you also say the pack size was roughly 5 animals?
Yep. So pack size is about 4.5 on average, and those are pretty small packs as well.
Yeah.
Compared to places out west. And that's where you start to see the high density is if you go out to some place like Yellowstone, for instance, you'll see large packs. Some of them are quite big in sizes you'd never see in Voyageurs. And yet the densities in Yellowstone are actually generally a little bit lower than you see in Voyageurs. And that's because those wolves there actually have bigger territories. They might have bigger packs, but their territories are much larger. So that means that the actual density is much lower, or not much lower, but is lower than we see here in Voyageurs, because we have small packs, but the territories are really small. So you can pack a lot more wolves in an area.
Yeah, on your website, again, along with showing all the beaver lodges that are in the area, you've got this wonderful map from GPS locations, 68,000 GPS locations you collected during the summer of 2018. And this wonderful map that shows basically, I guess it kind of defines the pack territories, no? The pack home ranges?
Yep, it shows. So we used the wolves are territorial animals, which we all know. And so what we decided to do is go through our GPS collar data and actually show a bunch of packs that, we had GPS collared wolves and all these packs that were next to one another, and show basically how their territories overlap or don't overlap that much in the area. And so it's just a really neat visualization. It's something biologists have known for a long time, but seeing it from the GPS collar data really kind of drives that message home that, yep, they kind of keep their own territory, and other wolves generally stay a little ways away.
Yeah, except for this one pack. I don't know if it's the Bowman Bay pack or the Moonshadow pack, but it looks like maybe it's the Bowman Bay pack, and they head out into Moonshadow or whatnot.
Yeah, and so that's one thing that the map doesn't show as well, which is hard to capture, is that pack made a lot of, or at least that individual wolf made a lot of what are called extraterritorial forays. That's the fancy word for basically they leave their territory and go exploring somewhere and then come back. And I'm not exactly sure what it was doing in those instances, but it's not an uncommon thing to see wolves doing that. And so sometimes while that map shows things, they look very neat and tidy, and sometimes it really is that way. There are other instances where it's a lot messier, and those don't make as good of maps because it just looks like a bunch of colored lines all over, right? So there is, so it's so that map generally shows the principle that yes, they're territorial, and these are how their territories fit together, but it doesn't capture sort of the variety you see in wolf behavior, because we do have wolves that sometimes just don't seem to care about other packs at all in the summer. They just kind of meander all over, or they make a jaunt into another pack's territory and then they come back to theirs, and then a little while later they go for a long jaunt into some other wolf's territory. And part of that is because wolves are probably always trying to assess to a degree what's kind of around their territory. It's sort of a way of understanding who their neighbors are and what competition there might be, what resources might be beyond their territory boundaries. And then the other is that a lot of young wolves, which make up most populations are young wolves, not old wolves. A lot of the young wolves are going to be leaving their packs in search of their own territory and their own mate. And those forays outside of their territory are thought by biologists to be these sort of exploratory missions where they leave their territories for the first time and really try to understand what's in the sort of great beyond before they decide to, like, I'm finally leaving for good. So they're kind of getting their toes wet. And then at some point, then they just leave for good. And that's when they start wandering widely, looking for their own mate, and they don't come back to their territory.
How territorial are your wolves? I know in Yellowstone National Park, it can be quite brutal if one wolf pack intrudes on another wolf pack's territory.
Yeah, so just like in Yellowstone, wolves and voyageurs are just as territorial. We've documented many wolves that have been killed by other wolves, particularly in the winter time. So that's when we generally see those the peaks in aggression, and that's usually when mating season is occurring. It was 2 years ago, we had a pack that was 3 wolves. It was 2 parents and their offspring, a 1-year-old female. And in a matter of 1 week, other wolves had killed both of that yearling's parents within a 1-week period in January. So all of a sudden you had this pack of 3 that was down to 1 because other wolves killed, her parents. And that's a little abnormal for us to document 2 wolves dying in a similar time frame from wolves, but we've documented many instances of dominant wolves in one pack being killed by presumably neighbors in the other packs.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. I mean, Voyageurs is roughly 350 square miles, and it looks like the wolves use all that territory.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And so I'd say the one thing that's also important to know about like Voyageurs is that we have, and the surrounding areas, that we have a saturated sort of wolf population. Like there's no place in or around our study area that doesn't have wolves that we've seen. And that's different than, let's say, some places that might be mountainous environments or desert environments where there's going to be some areas where you might just have unoccupied habitats because there's just not food there. That's not a spot that a wolf is really going to live. But in our area, everything's good habitat. And so we have wolves packed into our area. Our study area has kind of increased in size as we've kind of grown as a project and explored different things. But currently, our study area is about 2,300 square kilometers, which is about 900 square miles. That includes Voyageurs and then a big chunk of land south of the park as well. And this past winter, we had 24 packs that were using that area at one time. And that's because you just have packs literally just sort of packed in, for lack of better words, all throughout the study area.
Now, I'm curious, last year you came out with a piece for the Voyageurs Conservancy in their newsletter about pup survival and how incredibly variable it's been in recent years. Any insights into that?
Yeah, so pup survival is one of those things that's been very difficult to study in most environments because pups are born in dens, which are hard to locate in a forested ecosystem. And then being able to observe those pups through time as they kind of mature is also very difficult. And as a result, there's a lot that we don't know about pup survival. So we've been really trying to understand that well using remote cameras, GPS collared adult wolves, and things like that. And what we found is that pup survival ranges in our area from really low to moderate. So the best year we've documented to date for pup survival is, I think, 52%, which means that 52% of the pups on average survive to adulthood. But we've had a year that we estimate that survival was, I think it was 7 or 8%. At least I can't remember what I put in that article. That was a little bit ago. But we have a graduate student who's just finishing up her master's, and that was our estimate as we kind of looked through all of our data. That was about 7 or 8% of pups made it in, I think that was 2019 to 2020, meaning 93% of pups died before they reached 1 year of age. And interestingly, the best year and the worst year of pup survival occurred consecutively, right? So we went from the worst year to the best year we've documented back to back, which is really quite fascinating. At least I think it is from a biological level of how you can have such radical differences in survival of offspring just between 2 years. And so one of the things we're really interested in understanding long term is, why do we see that variability? Clearly something's going on that's driving it, and we're trying to understand, and not only understand but be able to sort of collect data that shows why that pattern exists, which explains really how the ecosystem works and how wolf populations as a whole function as well. Because if we can understand what are the factors driving pup survival, then we basically determine what are the factors driving wolf populations, because wolf population size is predominantly determined, at least in our area, by the number of pups that are able to make it to adulthood. So we're very interested in trying to peel back more layers about wolf pups. The other important thing to note is that while we've had this variability, on average, it appears that about 28 to 30% of pups make it to adulthood that are born in our area, which means that the vast majority of pups are never going to see their first birthday, or the vast majority of wolves that are ever born are never going to see their first birthday. And the reason we think that's the case is that there's just not enough food to keep all of those pups alive. So we think most of the pups are starving to death. That's their typical demise. And this is one of the ways that wolves also sort of intrinsically regulate their population size, is that, if there's not enough food, a lot of pups don't make it. And if there's lots of food, then maybe some more make it. And, we're trying to understand this too a little bit better as we collect more data, but those are our initial impressions.
Has there been a related impact on the overall wolf population in your area, or is it managing to stay somewhat stable number-wise?
So we consider the population in Voyageurs area to be stable, in the sense that if you plotted like a line looking at the population trajectory over the past decade, it would be pretty flat, meaning that it keeps kind of bouncing around a level of about 60 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers, our average density. But we see pretty sizable changes in population density through time. So we have some years where that will go really high, and then we'll see a decrease. So there's sort of like this big fluctuation around an average is what it appears to be. By and large, we consider the population in our area to be a high density, stable population. And then it's just going to kind of fluctuate as different environmental conditions change. There's changes in prey density, things like that.
You were saying earlier that it's a constant learning dynamic, because assumptions go out the window. Wolf behavior can surprise you. Any recent surprises beyond the fishing techniques that the wolves employ?
Well, probably one that's, for us at least, been really interesting is, when we first started doing this work, we didn't have a lot of great insights on sort of the social dynamics of wolves, pack structures and things like that, in part because it was very difficult to observe wolves in our area. And so when we started in 2015, remote camera technology was just sort of coming available. It was still pretty expensive. And at that time, it really only was photos. And so we didn't have a lot of insight into, we rarely got to see the wolves we studied. We might collar a wolf, and that might be the last time we ever see that wolf in person, or ever. We might never see it on a camera or anything like that. But as remote camera technology has gotten better, we now have almost 350 remote cameras in our area that are taking video footage year-round, capturing these different packs, allowing us to determine who's in each pack, what the structure composition is. We can identify individual wolves. So we're starting to approach, it certainly isn't analogous to Yellowstone, but we're approaching being able to at least understand dynamics kind of like they do, where we know the social structure and things like that. And what that has sort of revealed to us through time is that a lot of these packs in our area seem to be related to one another, not in the sense that they're like interbreeding with each other, but we're noting a lot of instances where a wolf is born into a pack in a certain area, and then 3-4 years later it ends up joining or becoming a breeding animal in a pack that's just 5 miles away or something like that, which to us was really surprising as biologists, because wolves typically wander very far and wide when they're looking for mates and territories. There's lots of instances of them traveling these incredible distances, and we see that too from wolves we have collared. But a lot of the wolves that are occupying packs in our area, we're learning through time and through not only cameras, but also genetic approaches too, that actually there's a lot of wolves that are joining packs here who were just born in the area. So there's not as many wolves coming into our system, setting up packs as we initially thought. And that's what we typically thought would happen. We thought there was like a pack in an area, something would happen, that pack would totally disband, and just totally new wolves would come settle in that area. That was our conception for many, many years. And now we've realized that's actually not the way it is. It's sort of like, oh yeah, this pack might disband, and then, okay, this wolf from the next neighboring pack comes in and just settles down right there. So a really short distance. And I think that to us is really fascinating to see, because it's giving us an understanding of how these populations really function. And that's been just really insightful and not what we thought. And I think that's, for us, is to someone in the general public, that might not seem like a huge revelation. But I think when you're so used to thinking about things, you have these assumptions you don't even question, because you're just like, well, I guess that must be how it is. I don't have any other data to suggest otherwise. And so then when you get information to show like, I've been thinking about that all wrong, it's really interesting, I think. It's not that it's not like we've made any huge erroneous conclusions. It's just that the way you conceptualize it just changes, and you're like, okay, we got to think about the way this population is working in a different light than we had been.
Is a wolf a wolf? And by that I mean you're doing a lot of research into the social structures of the packs there in Voyageurs National Park. Mm-hmm. Are they socially different than, say, the packs in Yellowstone, the packs in Royale, or the packs up in Alaska?
I'd say probably the biggest difference in a place like Voyageurs from, let's say, Yellowstone, is that Yellowstone, for instance, has really complex packs a lot of times, meaning that you have a lot of adults, you have subordinates, you have these large pack sizes, and so you have these complicated, let's say, interpersonal relationships between the members in the pack. And so you get a lot of these fascinating dynamics, which they've been able to observe there. In a place like Voyageurs, we have very simple packs, which are often just their parents, two parents, and then their pups, a couple pups maybe. So if you have a pack of, on average, 4 to 5 wolves, if 2 of those are the parents, then you can say, okay, we have 2 or 3 young ones. And so that means they're fairly simple most of the time. Obviously, then we get interesting things that happen where we see, strange configurations of different wolves, but it's certainly not in the same way that you see in Yellowstone. Now, Isle Royale is probably more similar to what we see. Their pack sizes, even though they can get some large ones, they can have some that are similar. The one thing that makes Isle Royale, though, a little bit unique is that because it's an island, wolves can't leave. And that does change probably some of the dynamics a little bit. Some wolves can wander around, but they're stuck, right? Whereas in Voyageurs, wolves don't have to make the choice of like, well, I'm stuck on the island, so do I stay part of my pack, or do I just wander around myself and risk getting killed or whatever? Voyageurs, they're just like, well, I'm out of here, and they can just go, right, and travel hundreds of kilometers if they want to. So I would say a wolf is certainly a wolf, but I think what you see when you compare, let's say, different wolf populations in Yellowstone, Isle Royale, Minnesota, etc., is that there's a lot of variability. Wolves are very flexible on a social side of things, and they can change, how those packs operate is going to be dependent on a lot of factors, probably such as the size of the prey they're going after, because the size of the prey dictates how many wolves can be fed after a kill's made, and that can then influence some of the social dynamics. So there's all these sort of fascinating patterns that occur. And I think as a biologist, that's one of those things that you think is the most fascinating, is that the variability is what makes it fascinating. If they were all the same everywhere, it'd be like, well, it's just the same thing again. But it's like we see big differences, and I think that's really fascinating.
That's Dr. Thomas Gable, the project leader for the Voyageurs Wolf Project. They've been studying wolves in Voyageurs National Park since 2015, and there's no end in sight. Tom, I appreciate your time today. It's fascinating work that you're doing up there. It's always interesting to learn how different populations of the same species are behaving differently in different areas of the national park system. If people want to contribute to your site, to your work rather, obviously they can go to your website, voyagerswolfproject.org, and learn more about what you're doing there as well.
Absolutely. Yep, that's fantastic. And you can also follow us on any major social media platform as well. That's where we share a lot of updates. If you want to see the wolves in and around Voyageurs National Park, we share a lot of trail camera footage and things like that, and try to make the wolves accessible to folks, because unlike Yellowstone, you can't just show up to Voyageurs and see them.
Unfortunately, but you can probably hear them at night in the summertime, right?
You can sometimes hear them, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Do things slow down in the winter? Do you do field research in the winter months?
Yeah, so our winters they're slower than the summer, I would say, but they're still busy. So in the winters when we do all of our population estimates, so we've got our 350 trail cameras out that we need to get to and keep those functional. And then recently we've started doing some winter predation work to try to get a better understanding of the dynamics that are going on in winter as well as summer, as sort of we think about how to maybe understand the wolf population as a whole a bit better. And that gives us just an idea of, okay, how different is winter than summer? What can we make of that? And in where we're at, northern Minnesota, that is a topic of big discussion right now, is sort of wolf-deer interactions. What impact, if any, do wolves have on deer populations? How many deer do wolves kill? And fortunately, we're in a position where we can study those kind of things and hopefully provide some answers.
Well, Tom, certainly thanks for your time today and sharing insights with your research and what you're finding there. And we're going to keep following you guys and see what you discover down the road.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. To learn more about the Voyageurs Wolf Project and its research, or to send a donation to help with its work, visit voyagerswolfproject.org. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.